In understanding the concept of safety and violence, there's an analogy I want to draw in what law tries to achieve. Let's talk about justice on the one hand and order on the other. And law has always tried to straddle this particular divide between justice and order. So on the one hand, law is nothing more than a series of rules guaranteed or seeking to guarantee that there is an ordered society. So that gives you the order. Justice is quite a different aspect altogether. Justice requires you to go deeper to understand the extent to which everybody within that particular society can benefit from certain elements within it. And this straddle between order and justice has been a constant battle, and unfortunately law has always come down on the side of order. So there are different weights that people give these particular concepts, and it's hard to understand where you fit in that spectrum between, on the one hand, creating a society that's ordered, on the other hand, ensuring that the order is not just order, but a just order. That is, an order with justice at the heart of it. Cities give you a landscape to examine that concept against, because cities, on the one hand, will function well if they are ordered, if everything works as it should, if there's a good health system, if there's a good traffic system, if the sanitation works, if businesses feel comfortable in investing there. So you need order to run a city. But what about justice? How important is justice in the agenda of cities? Now, justice for me in that particular concept would be to understand a city where all the inhabitants there have access equally to those mechanisms you've created. So the challenge is not just to stop at order, but to ensure that the order we create is a just order. And for me, if you can create that just order in a city, then you're moving a great way towards generating the safety and the freedom from violence that you want to. We need to also understand that violence is not just physical aggression, but that violence contains a range of different spectrums, all of which somehow contribute to people being unsafe and, as a consequence, contribute to insecurities. The current debate in many states and many societies and many cities is, this threat of terrorism. Let me just put that in a perspective. If people feel that they don't have a stake in society, if they feel their voices are not going to be understood and included, they have nothing to gain in that society. They are no longer stakeholders. That means they can blow things up, they can damage things, they can throw things at it. If, on the other hand, you are a stakeholder and you feel that you can somehow address the societal problems that either you as an individual face or your community faces, well, then you might decide that somehow blowing things up isn't the best option, and that maybe you need to negotiate and maybe you need to engage in conversation. This challenge is acute in cities. It's particularly acute because you have conglomerations of people from different ethnicities, different religious backgrounds, who come there to the great place on the hill to try and make their money, to try and ensure that they have a sustainable lifestyle. What happens when they fail? What happens when particular groups somehow don't make it? Why do they not make it? In India, for instance, in British colonial India, when the British were looking at Adivasis, what we know as Adivasis now, they had a piece of legislation in 1871 called the Criminal Tribes Act. Just think about this, Criminal Tribes Act. That meant that entire swathes of populations were deemed as criminals before they'd committed a crime. They were the criminal tribes. Why? Well, because one of the individuals may have been caught committing a crime. Does that make the entire tribe a criminal tribe? Now, this isn't some kind of anti-colonial rhetoric. The Indian government in 1952 has something called the Habitual Offenders Act. Very similar. So you have this idea that somehow there are criminal classes and then there's the rest of society. When you interrogate that idea a little bit further, you realize that these tags don't fit. These tags are ways in which you exclude particular population, keep them far removed from sites of power, and then insist that the scraps that they are thrown should be enough for them too to play the game as we want them to play it. That is a fundamental problem. It's a fundamental problem because it does not build security for them, it builds security for us. And the consequence of building security for us, we need to understand in a shared, crowded space like a city, is security for me necessarily involves security for my neighbor. I can't be walking around in a security bubble if my neighbor is feeling insecure, because my neighbor's insecurity is going to impact me in dramatic terms because of the proximity they feel to me and because of the physical way in which we co-live in cities. That person's insecurity is going to impact me If their way of dealing with their insecurity is to use violence, that violence is going to impact me. We don't live in bubbles in cities. I know there are many attempts to do that. There are many gated communities all over all the cities in the world. Those gates are only effective as long as you police them effectively. The problem with policing them effectively is there are always more creative ways to avoid that particular policing. So we have a choice here. We either understand how we can create inclusive societies that benefit all, or we decide for whatever tag you want to use. You decide these people are somehow X. These people are terrorists. These people are habitual offenders. These people are criminals. These people are thieves. We can build that narrative for ourselves. We can try and build walls to keep those people out. They will find a way of getting in. There is no way you can physically win that particular security battle. You've got to try something else. If you're trying to put a nail into a wall and you keep hammering it harder and harder, and you decide, oh, well, that's not going in, I need a bigger hammer, and you bring the biggest hammer you want to, and you keep hammering it, and it's still not going in, we need to pause and ask ourselves whether that in fact is a nail, or perhaps it's a screw. Perhaps it needs a screwdriver. We need to think about some different tools than the simple tools that we have, where we collectively tag people as X, and then we collectively put in place mechanisms that would try to deal with them, that sweep everybody up in that particular mechanism, that collectively punish everyone, and then resort to excluding them from any potential solutions of the future. This is at the heart of the city's agenda, and getting it right is the only way in which we can move towards safe and sustainable cities. If you look at our criminal justice institutions, and again, I would like you to examine the Minority Rights Forum that took place, the 8th Minority Rights Forum that you will see a webcast of if you decide to look in this link. If you look at that particular forum, you will see stories from across the world. The basic fact is minorities, ethnic communities, linguistic groups, women are underrepresented in the institutions, but very often, especially for minorities, overrepresented as inmates. So you have here a problem by which minorities are being tagged as criminals, sometimes because they may have committed criminal acts, often because of the bias of the institution who has nobody from that community there. So you then have swathes of people who appear to be criminals and swathes of people, other swathes of people who appear to be policemen or policewomen, policemen usually. And that's a problem because there is no empathy between the criminal justice institution and the so-called criminals. Very often, many of those so-called criminals we later find are under trials with no case to answer. Very often we find that even if they had a case to answer, the punishment, often of waiting for their trial for long periods of time, criminalizes them. So this is to say that the mechanisms we have within cities, and the criminal justice mechanism is just one of those. The criminal justice mechanisms does not make our societies safer, it actually makes them more violent. If that is a problem, we need to assess that problem with an objective, calm mind, put our prejudices aside, and start trying to solve the problem and move towards ways in which we can engender and find mechanisms to address this. If it's safety and freedom from violence we are after, that is an aspiration we can achieve. But to be able to achieve that aspiration, we have to get out of the box that we often put other people in. And that is, in the cities, is particularly acute because you see that whichever city you look at. Prison conditions are often vile because society feels these are individuals who should not have any more stake, so they lock them up somewhere. Inevitably, those criminal justice institutions, especially prisons, are overrepresented by people from one particular caste, one particular ethnic group, one particular religion. Inevitably, in that particular religion or in that particular setting in which they are left, they come together in common cause. And the one cause they have is they feel excluded. And they are left with plenty of time, with nothing to do, and the impact is immediate. Instead of moving towards a society that creates gainful employment, that uses all the resources at its behest, that ensures that every single element that inhabits the small space in which we live can actually benefit every individual, we don't. We create wealth that benefits the few inevitably that wealth that benefits the few is then used as almost an instrument to avoid everybody else gaining from it. So inclusive is a word I would suggest is fundamental to understanding how cities of the future should operate. That inclusivity has to engage with all communities. There's a very famous criminologist who started his career at the institution I work in now in Middlesex University in London. His name was Jock Young, and he looked quite a lot at riots that took place in cities like London that were Afro-Caribbean. So they were labeled as Afro-Caribbean riots. I said, oh, these black people are destroying the city. They're somehow undermining it. And again, not that dissimilar to my example on the Criminal Tribes Act, Habitual Offenders Act. If you tag people with a brush and tell them that they're actually criminals, and as a consequence of that, exclude them, how do they participate in your inclusive society? How do they? How do they then sit with you at a boardroom? How do they then sit with you within your institutions? How do they make decisions around budgets with you? How is it that you can do that? If we have to understand that crime, a fundamental aspect of dealing with crime is to assume the presumption of innocence. Everybody is innocent until proven guilty beyond a shadow of doubt. We don't have that principle very firmly rooted in our imaginations. We have it in our laws, but it's not in our imaginations. In our imaginations, we label people, and in cities, we seem to do it very much more. There was an aspiration at the start of globalization. Thomas Frank, a very famous international lawyer, talked about this phenomenon of post-modern tribalism. The argument is, look, globalization is going to bring all these communities together. We can benefit from the richness and the diversity. It will no longer matter what your gender is, what your religion is, what you eat at home, how you dress. We will just engage with each other as human beings. Hopefully, we will learn from each other. We might also dislike each other, but we will keep those dislikes to ourselves. We will engage in a manner that's fair. That dream lies shattered. Because in fact, what happened in cities is as these communities came together, there was a greater insecurity that was framed, and people realized that, oh well, if I'm going to succeed, that means I need to succeed in competition with the other group that's also trying to succeed. And that particular competition didn't bring the best out of each. It was a race to the bottom. And in that particular race to the bottom, our criminal justice institutions played a big role because they used this kind of ethos, this lens that suggested that some groups had a higher propensity to crime than others. As a consequence, you still see a bias, for instance, across the world. Financial crimes do not get the same kind of punishment that other types of crimes get. Why is that? When we know that the current economic crisis starting from 2008 that has spanned now, will span a decade and perhaps more, how is it that the people who are responsible for the financial crimes that have given us this don't face the same kind of angst and same kind of bias that somebody who steals a purse might feel? What is the logic behind that? Why is it that we feel justified in being able to treat the petty criminal who might be trying to feed her or his family? Why is it that we feel disdain towards them and don't feel disdain towards the crimes of the powerful, the financial crimes of the powerful, which have created systems that have prevented the extent to which societies can generate the kind of wealth that we all collectively rely on to be able to have a sustainable future and a sustainable world? I think that's the challenge we face. If we understand that particular challenge, and if we interpret that particular challenge in creating fairer institutions, we will then create the bulwark to be able to allow cities to be those wealth-generating, ideas-generating, progressive elements we need them to be if we are going to understand a sustainable world for 2030 and beyond. Thank you.